So the last time that we were talking, we had talked about the Mexican-American War, in which the United States went to war with Mexico, and it got California, New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, really expanded its territory. It was a war that started because the United States had tried to buy territory from Mexico. Mexico would not sell their country. I know, that's shocking, right? I mean, I would certainly sell Arkansas, but the United States deliberately started a war with Mexico to conquer the territory. And as I said last time, there was a lot of people who said that this was a great war at first. And then afterwards, if you read General Grant's biography, one of the best presidential biographies out there, said it was an unrighteous war, that we shouldn't have done what we did. And there was a lot of remorse about it. Not enough remorse to return the land, but they felt some remorse about the property. And of course, there was a huge debate in the United States about the war with Mexico, because there were people who thought it was going to be used to expand slavery. We look at Henry David Thoreau living out in Walden. He goes to jail. He won't pay his poll taxes because he thinks the war is going to be used to promote slavery. And of course, he writes his famous book on civil disobedience, which impacts later on Gandhi and, oddly enough today, Martin Luther King, right? The idea is that you have a duty to break unjust laws. That's a theory of, there's a theory of law called the idealist theory, which says that a law is only a law if it is just and in accordance with God's law, and that you are under no obligation to follow that law. Now, it doesn't mean that you run away, that you break the law as Martin Luther King did or Gandhi did, and you suffered the consequences for breaking the law, but you broke the law because you thought it was an unjust law that was not in accordance with God's law. So this is this non-violent civil disobedience. This certainly comes out of David Thoreau. So the war is over. So I'm sort of catching you up there. And now the question is, what are we going to do with these new territories? Are they going to become states? Well, let's look at the arguments here. We talked about John C. Calhoun. And for those of you who have not been with us, John C. Calhoun, South Carolina, he's part of what they call the Great Triumvirate. There were 3 legislators in this time period. And this is when the legislature dominated, not the president. Daniel Webster from the Northeast, Henry Clay from Kentucky, which was the West, and John C. Calhoun, who was from the South. Calhoun was this enormous thinking kind of guy, right? Brilliant guy. So we talked about John C. Calhoun. He's a big states' rights advocate. He's a big slavery owner. And then there was Ralph Waldo Emerson. He is sort of your original beatnik hippie kind of guy. He's the leader of the transcendentalist, right? That he believed that you could sit back and there was a world outside the concrete senses, and that was intuition, that we all had this inner light and we should be using our feelings. I mean, those are 2 people that are completely different in their outlook of life, but they both sense that the Mexican War would lead to disaster. Calhoun said that Mexico is a forbidden fruit that would lead to our political death. That's an exact quote. Emerson said, the United States will conquer Mexico, but it will be a man who swallows arsenic. Mexico will poison us. And why will it poison us? Because of the issue of slavery. Now, when the war breaks out on August 8th, 1846, an obscure congressman from Pennsylvania that you'll never hear from again by the name of David Wilmot enters a resolution into the House of Representatives that slavery will not be permitted in any territories acquired by the war with Mexico. Now, this is never going to become law, but it politicizes slavery once and for all. The House approves the Wilmot Proviso, but then it goes to the Senate, right, where the South has equal representation. Calhoun responds to the Wilmot Provisos with the Calhoun resolutions, saying that slaves were property, so Congress could not stop citizens from taking slaves into the territories. To do so would violate the Bill of Rights. Now, his resolutions never come to a vote, but this is something that you're starting to see here with slave owners, is that they believe that if you try to restrict slavery, you're violating the Bill of Rights. Now, think about that for a moment. They're taking a document that is designed to guarantee the rights of people and use it to guarantee slavery. It's the thought. Well, everybody's looking for some sort of way out of this slavery issue in the territories. They're looking for some sort of compromise. President Polk said, well, why don't we just extend that Missouri Compromise line, which is the top border of Oklahoma, all the way across to the Pacific and say above you can't have slavery, below you can. That doesn't get anywhere. Lewis Cass of Michigan suggested that maybe citizens of a territory, just like citizens of a state, could regulate their own concerns. This became known as popular sovereignty or squatter sovereignty. In other words, if the citizens of a territory didn't want to have slavery, don't adopt it. Now, this does not directly challenge slaveholders in the new lands, but it did promise that the new territories would open and quickly free farmers would dominate the new lands, and then there wouldn't be slavery. This is still not passed by Congress. So they're still groping for this solution of what to do about slavery in the territories. So that brings us to the election of 1848. The Democrats nominate Lewis Cass, the guy who came up with popular sovereignty. Now, their party platform didn't speak of popular sovereignty, but said Congress could not interfere with slavery in the states and all efforts to interfere with slavery in the states, okay, because that's their own domestic institution. Now, the Whigs, they think about Henry Clay. And for those of you who haven't been here before, Clay ran in 1824, he ran in 1832, and here they think, well, maybe we'll run him again, but he's getting pretty doggone old. Yeah, I say old, he's 72, 73, and now we have presidents who are running who are 74 and 78, right? So they pass over him. And so the Whigs, who had had some success with William Henry Harrison, a former general, decided to go with Zachary Taylor. Remember we talked about Zachary Taylor, that during the Mexican War that Polk wanted to have a war big enough to get what he wanted, but not too big to create war heroes who would run for president. Well, Zachary Taylor became a war hero, and so he's going to run for president. Now, Taylor is a legal resident of Louisiana. He owned 100 slaves, which makes him part of the planter class. And he had never, ever voted in a national election. Well, the party, and this is weird, it rarely happens, the party adopts no platform. For those of you who don't know what a platform is a statement of what the party believes. And so, for example, if you're a party that says, we believe in tax cuts, a balanced budget, free trade, each one of those ideas is known as a plank. And then you put all the planks together and it builds a platform. They adopt no platform. By the way, it's just interesting because this year in the 2020 election, the Republican Party did not adopt a platform. That's rare. And we get a third party, a new party shows up. It's called the Free Soil Party. The Free Soil Party adopted the idea of popular sovereignty. The Free Soil Party is made up of rebellious Democrats, mainly from New York, some anti-slavery Whigs, and some members of the Liberty Party. Remember, the Liberty Party was our first anti-slavery party in 1840. They had nominated James G. Birney, but just a very minor party. They nominate Martin Van Buren as their presidential candidate. Why, I don't know, right? Van Buren, the little magician, had been president in 1836. He was a one-termer. They'd called him Martin Van Ruin. Not a very successful president, but they're going to go with Martin Van Buren. And they have a pretty good slogan, too. Their slogan is free soil, free speech, free labor, and free men. Not bad. The impact of the Free Soilers, though, is that they split the Democratic vote in New York to allow Taylor to win there. If there's no Free Soil Party, then we're talking about President Cass, not President Taylor. So Taylor is able to win because the Free Soil Party, a third party, split the vote. And even today, that's where we see the issues of third parties. They could split votes, or sometimes they'll pull a party further left or further right, depending on the party. Well, on January 24th, 1848, gold is discovered in California. Gold! Oh my gosh, who knew? And in 1849, 80,000 people moved to California. Now, I know we all know what those people are called. At least I hope we all know. They are called 49ers. Thank you. So I'm trying to read people talking about tacos. Yeah, if you're hearing noise talking, there's play practice going on. We're doing a play of Steel Magnolias. I'm not in it. It's an all-female cast. I am doing the lighting and the sound for it, but this is just rehearsal. So back to the regularly scheduled lecture as we talk about Compromise of 1850. So you get 80,000 people moved to California. This is a problem, and I'm taking you all the way back to the Land Ordinance of 1787. And if you have your notes, which you probably don't have any notes, but you can go back and look at the video. The Land Ordinance of 1787 had set up how a territory could become a state. And they believed it would be a slow process, that people would slowly move in. And when you got to 5,000, you could get a territorial legislature. And then eventually, when you got to 60,000, you could apply to statehood. And they thought this would take, 5, 10, maybe 15 years. Well, in 1 year, 80,000 people moved to California. So California is thinking, we want to become a state right now. But the question is, will they become a free state or a slave state? Now, Southern Whigs and Democrats said, well, Taylor owns 100 slaves. He'll be with us and support slavery in California. Well, they're wrong. Taylor believed that slavery should be upheld where it existed, but he had very little patience with abstract theories about slavery in the territories where it probably could not exist. In other words, he didn't think that slavery could exist in California. It didn't have the climate to grow the exotic crops that were needed. So why are we fighting over this? And his thought was, why not make California and New Mexico, by the way, who's ready to become a state, immediately and try to bypass the issue, do it as fast as we can, get out of this whole slavery talk. And Californians were way ahead of it. In December of 1849, without consulting Congress, they organized a free state government. And New Mexico did the same in June of 1850. And then Taylor asked for immediate statehood. He says, we need these to become state immediately, and they would come in as free states. And maybe we can just make this happen so fast that we can avoid the whole argument. Well, now the stage is set for a great Senate debate, which I have not understood why they haven't made a movie about this yet. It's one of the great debate of American political history. And it's the last battle between Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, and John C. Calhoun. And I keep bringing these people up. There's a great book on this called The Great Triumvirate. It was these three people representing different parts of the country that had shepherded the country through the tough times, that would find ways to find compromise and bring people together, the different sections. But this is their last battle. They're getting up there in age. And then you've got this really interesting supporting cast that you'll hear of before. William Seward, who's going to be Lincoln's Secretary of State, Stephen Douglas, the Lincoln-Douglas debate, Jefferson Davis, the future president of the Confederacy, and Thomas Hart Benton, who once beat up Andrew Jackson. These are all senators. So they're all in there. Now, Clay, if you remember, Clay was known as the Great Compromiser. He came up with the Missouri Compromise in 1820. He came up with the Tariff Compromise in 1832, avoiding the nullification crisis. And so they always look for Clay to make compromises. And so Clay, now 73, takes on his last role as the Great Compromisers. And in January of 1850, he brings forth 8 resolutions to solve these problems. And here's what he says. He goes, okay, first off, we'll admit California as a free state. We'll do that. Then we'll organize the rest of the Southwest without restriction to slavery. In other words, we're not going to take any other states. We're going to just say these are open states. We're not going to talk about, open territories. We're not going to talk about slavery right now. We'll leave it up to a future date. Then another part was deny Texas, for you Texas lovers, its extreme claim. If you remember, Texas said that they actually own the land to the Rio Grande to its source all the way up into Idaho. And they said, look, no, you're not getting all that land. So they're going to say, we're going to not let you have that much land, because they wanted to use that land to divide up for other states in the future. They would compensate Texas for this by assuming Texas debt. Number 5, they would uphold slavery in the District of Columbia. But 6, they would abolish the slave trade across the boundaries of the District of Columbia. Okay, so that requires a little bit of explanation. Here's the problem. America's the land of the free, and you've got this Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal. but it's also at the capital where you've got all these embassies. And so the Americans are saying these things, and then walking down Pennsylvania Avenue, you had all these Africans in chains going up onto auctions. It looked bad. And so they said, look, we can't have that anymore. So we're going to abolish that slave trade in Washington, D.C. You can still own slaves in Washington, D.C., and you can sell them to your neighbors, but we don't want our dirty laundry being edited out, being out there in the public. So that's why they did it. And then number 7, they would adopt a more effective Fugitive Slave Act, meaning that the federal government would be much more involved in trying to get slaves who had tried to run away to freedom back to the South. And then number 8, they would deny congressional authority to interfere with the interstate slave trade. Now that's interesting too, right? Because under the Constitution, the federal government has the final say in any type of interstate trade between the states. Intrastate trade, which is within the state itself, is a state responsibility. So that's his 8 ideas. On February 5th and 6th, Clay, who's now looking pretty haggard in his appearance, rose in all his eloquence to defend his proposal. And listen to what he says here. He said he called for the adoption in the interest of peace and harmony. And he argued that if they did not agree, it could lead to a disastrous civil war. Okay, so here's Henry Clay from Kentucky. He's telling you 10 years in advance, this is an issue of slavery in the territories. We could end up being in a civil war. On March 4th, John C. Calhoun, the second part of the Great Triumvirate, is dying of tuberculosis. He left his sickbed. They wheel him into the Senate chamber. He can't talk. So his colleagues read his defiant remarks. And here's what he's saying in 1850. He said, slavery must be protected or the end result will be disunion. He said the South needed acceptance of its rights. Okay, so we're looking here 10 years beforehand. They're not talking about the tariff. They're not talking about states' rights. They are talking about slavery. And that's something that it's going to be the constant theme throughout the 1850s. Now, the last member of our triumvirate that's going to speak is, of course, Daniel Webster. Webster was the supreme orator of his age, the godlike Webster, right? We've probably even heard the story of the devil and Daniel Webster, right? His theme is going to be preservation of the Union, just like he had done, if you remember, maybe 2 lectures ago in Webster's second reply to Hayne. He had said, the Union now, the Union forever, right? He said, look, let's not argue about this. The extent of slavery has already been defined by the Northwest Ordinance from 1787, the Missouri Compromise of 1820, and he said, in the new lands, by the laws of nature. In other words, places where you just would not be able to grow cotton or tobacco. He says, sure, both sides have their grievances. Both pro-slavery and anti-slavery have their grievances. He said that the North had infernal fanatics and abolitionists, and the South had their people that wanted to expand slavery. These people were often called filibusters. These filibusters wanted to seize Cuba and instead put slavery there. They wanted to take over Nicaragua. David Walker did, and put slavery there. David Walker ended up in front of a wall with a lot of people pointing guns at him in Nicaragua. Didn't end well. But he asked everybody not to threaten secession. He goes, look, don't threaten that you're going to leave the country. But he said, let all enjoy the fresh air of liberty. Fresh air of liberty, not available in certain southern states, obviously. Well, the New Englanders, who Daniel Webster had served for a long period of time, call him Benedict Arnold for not coming down harsher on slavery. So you think of it that way, where he's worked for the people of New England for 40 years, and his last time he's being called Benedict Arnold. In April, all of Clay's resolutions are bundled into one omnibus bill. So the question is, how is Zachary Taylor going to handle this? Well, on July 4th, 1850, at the Friends of the Union rally, Taylor attends in the hot sun. He has some cherries, he's had some cucumbers and some cabbage, and then he gets sick. right? Because really you weren't supposed to do these kind of things, eat some of these foods in the heat of the summer. They just weren't safe. And he dies 5 days later. Now, recently, within the last 30 years, historians, or at least a few historians, had suggested that maybe he had been poisoned by pro-slavery advocates. So, oddly enough, in 1992, we dug up Zachary Taylor's body to check for arsenic in his bones. And guess what? We didn't find any. And so we threw his bones back in, threw some dirt on him, and went along our way. Well, there's a new president in town. You know him, you love him. He's Millard Fillmore. Self-educated guy, son of a poor farmer, made it on his own as a lawyer and as a politician. And with Fillmore around, there's a better chance of compromise because Taylor was ready, as a Southerner, was ready to go to war over the issue, right? He was going to say, look, I'm not putting up with these Southerners thinking they're going to leave the Union or begin a civil war. But Fillmore supports Clay's compromises. And thanks to the efforts of the so-called Little Giant, that was Stephen Douglas, who you'll remember from the Lincoln-Douglas debates, they reached the Compromise of 1850. California is admitted as a free state, which ends, by the way, the old free state, slave state balance in the Senate. Remember, it used to be that every time they entered a free state, they would bring a slave state in so that the Senate would be equal. Now, this is the beginning, by the way, of where we're going to see that the South is realizing they're losing control over the presidency. Because if you go back and look at up until 1848, right, the number of Northerners who were president, and they were only 4-year terms, there was John Adams, John Quincy Adams, and Martin Van Buren. Southerners dominated the presidency partly out of how they allowed free states and slave states coming in. New Mexico's made a territory, no regard to slavery. Texas is given its present location, plus Texas gets $10 million. And Texas gets to keep its public land. Now, I'm giving you some free Texas government stuff. Usually, when a state came into the Union, the federal government took over the land. I mean, and you've seen this in places like Nevada, where the federal government owns most of the land. I remember just a few years ago, you had some guy trying to hold off federal marshals, arguing that he could get his cattle on federal land and not have to pay for it. But Texas maintained its public lands. And today, that's why we have a commissioner of the General Land Office, and we use those lands to help fund universities. We lease them out for mineral rights and for cattle ranching and dachshund ranching. Is dachshund ranching a thing? I don't know. Maybe it is. Maybe it isn't. How am I supposed to know? I'm not a historian. Utah was made a territory with no mention of slavery. And then they passed a Fugitive Slave Act, making the return of slaves to owners under federal jurisdiction. And it offered a $10 reward for information on fugitive slaves. And judges would get a bonus if they found the person guilty of being a fugitive slave. Now, this is an interesting argument too, because Northern outrage will be very upset and they will break the law. There's even a Supreme Court case, I believe, Abelman versus Booth, in which a Northern state says, I don't want to follow this federal law and claim states' rights. And the Southern states say, no, you don't have states' rights. You have to follow federal law. So it shows you how fast this goes. Now, not long after the Compromise of 1850, Calhoun's dead, Webster's dead, and Clay's dead. And for many, they felt that this was a bad sign for America, that the great statesmen were now gone. And think about that today, too. Here we're talking about great statesmen in the legislature. Do we see that as much anymore? These great statesmen in the legislature that really shepherd a lot of things through, and I don't think you do. But I don't want to opinionize too much on that issue. But I do think that's probably true. Yeah, I think no, we don't see it. So I'm going to go a little bit past the election of 1850, just because it's important. we're going to hit the election of 1852. Now, Millard Fillmore is out. The Democrats are going to choose a Connecticut. Who knows? Who cares? They're from Connecticut, right? Franklin Pierce. Now, remember they had picked James K. Polk in 1844 from North Carolina. I tell you this because their slogan, which is just god-awful, really, was that we poked you in 1844, we shall pierce you in 1852. Okay, that's just bad, right? Their platform pledged to abide by the Compromise of 1850. Now, the Whigs choose a general, right? They keep choosing generals. That hasn't worked out really well for them, right? Because the first Whig president was William Henry Harrison. He dies in office. The second Whig president was Zachary Taylor. He dies in office. So if I'm Winfield Scott, I'm thinking, do I really want to be a Whig president? Maybe not. But Winfield Scott, brilliant general, and we'll come back to him at the Civil War because it's his strategy that wins the war for the North, is not much better in politics, though. He's very politically inept. He's anti-slavery. He is a nativist. And so he's alienated the South, he's alienated the Irish, and he's alienated the Germans. So he's alienating everybody hoping to win an election, and it doesn't work. And Franklin Pierce is elected president. And where I want to sum up with this, with Franklin Pierce being president, is that his wife never wanted him to be president. And on the way to the inauguration to Washington, they went by train. He, his family, and his young son, the train overturned and rolled and ended up crushing Polk's son. Polk had tried to make it before his wife could see it. She saw the dead body of her son and never forgave Franklin Pierce for the death of her son. And so it's an interesting story about Franklin Pierce, a one-term president. All right. So next time, because this is where we're going to stop, the next time we are going to talk about the Old South. What was it like in the Old South? There's the mythology of, the Greedy from the Harriet Tubman, not the Harriet Tubman books, the Harriet Beecher Stowe books. There's the mythology of Gone with the Wind, which is that whole lost cause mythology. We want to talk about what life was like for the slave population. And then following to that, we will move into one of the most controversial laws in American history, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which is going to lead to really the beginning of the Civil War. It'll be a civil war in Kansas between northern Kansas and southern Kansas, and it will lead to the destruction of the Whig Party. So we'll do that next Monday.